commemoration of the 60th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. The Barbarossa Plan. On the 18th of December of 1940, Hitler signed the main directive of the Barbarossa Plan, number 21, of the General Headquarters of the German Military Forces, outlining the war against the USSR. It was based on a strategy of a blitzkrieg, mastered in practice in previous military campaigns. It stipulated an attack of 3 shock subdivisions in 3 strategic directions. The first subdivision, based in eastern Prussia, was to move towards Pskov and Leningrad. The second one, from the area to the east of Warsaw, was to advance towards Minsk and Smolensk. The task of the third one, concentrated in Lublin region, was to strike Zhytomyr and Kiev. Moreover, it was planned to stage some additional attacks from Finland against Leningrad and Murmansk, and from the territory of Romania against Mogilov-Podolsky, Zmerenka and the coast of the Black Sea. The Germans prepared to annihilate the main forces of the Soviet army to the west of the Dnieper and the western Dwina. Later, it was planned to seize Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev and the Donetsk basin. The majority of the Russian land forces in western Russia were to be eliminated by daring operations centered around quick and massive tank offensives. It was also necessary to prevent the retreat of the surviving enemy deeper into Russia. The final goal of the offensive was isolation from the Asiatic Russia along the general line Arkhangelsk-the Volga. Thus, in case of need, the last Russian industrial region of Ural could be paralyzed by means of air force. Note: on the 22nd of June of 1941, the German infantry division consisted of about 16,859 men and had 299 guns and mortars and 902 cars. The Soviet Infantry Division had only 10,858 men, 140 guns and mortars, and 203 cars. The German Tank Division included 16,932 men, 276 guns and mortars, 2,147 cars, and 200 tanks. The Soviet Tank Division had 10,942 men, 97 guns and mortars, 1,360 cars, and 375 tanks. In total, on the 22nd of June of 1941, the German army was 7,234,000 men strong. The overall strength of the Soviet army amounted to 5,200,000 men. They were united in 3 divisions and 22 brigades. 166 divisions and 9 brigades, that is over 54%, were located in the western military districts. Thus, in the first days of war, 166 divisions and 9 brigades of the Soviet Army in western regions faced the South Army Group under the lead of the Field Marshal Rundstedt, 57 divisions and 13 brigades including the 1st Tank Group of Kleist, the Center Army Group under the command of Field Marshal Bock, 50 divisions and 2 brigades including the 2nd and the 3rd Tank Groups of Guderian and Gott, and the North Army Group headed by the Field Marshal Leib, 29 divisions including the 4th Tank Group of Göttner. Having an obvious advantage in manpower and suddenness, Hitler's strategists confidently prophesied at the final meeting that the war against the USSR wouldn't last longer than 3-4 months. On the 22nd of June, the Fascist Germany started the hostilities against the USSR without declaring a war. The invasion. At 3:15 on the 22nd of June of 1941, the Air Force of the Fascist Germany delivered crippling strokes on the Soviet frontier fortifications, aerodromes and places of disposition of front units and formations of the Red Army. The air attacks woke up Murmansk, Kronstadt, Riga, Minsk, Kiev, Zhytomyr, Izmail, Odessa and Sevastopol. Thanks to the high concentration of forces, the aggressor managed to intrude into the Soviet territory for 50 kilometers by the end of the first day. Sometimes the enemy had an eightfold advantage. Thus, two infantry divisions of the Fifth Army, dispersed along the western Bug to the south of Severodolensky, were attacked by 6 infantry and 1 tank division of the enemy. The next day, the Germans brought in another 2 corps. In the first days of the war, Infantry Division number 120 faced 3 tank and 1 infantry divisions of the enemy. They were followed by 3 armored infantry divisions of the second echelon. The garrison of Brest Fortress, that shielded the strategic main route towards Minsk and Moscow, and consisting of 3,500 men, fought with 45th German Infantry Division, supported by the artillery and air force. On the 29th of June, the German newspaper Völkische Beobachter wrote, "A Russian soldier excels our Western enemy in his contempt of death. His endurance and fatalism keep him fighting until he is killed in the trench or falls dead in hand-to-hand fight." Note: according to some sources, by mid-July the Soviet losses included 3,500 airplanes. Germany, by the beginning of invasion, had 3,900 airplanes, 6,000 tanks, while Germany, by the beginning of invasion, had 4,300 tanks. During 3 weeks of the war, the Soviet divisions had 850,000 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. German troops lost about 100,000 soldiers and officers in the same period of time. On the 26th of June, 2 Soviet armies were rounded up to the east of Bialystok. On the 30th of June, Riga was seized, then Grodno. Brest-Litovsk and Minsk, where Germans boasted taking 323,000 people prisoners. By the 29th of June, von Klei's tanks captured Rovno, and by the 10th and 12th of July, Zhytomyr and Berdychev fell. On the 18th of July, Germans came close to Kiev. On the 16th of July, the second tank group of Guderian broke into Smolensk from the south. On coming close to Yartsevo, the third tank group of General Gott turned southward and joined the units of the second tank group. As a result, the 16th Army of General Lukin and the 20th Army of General Kurochkin were surrounded to the north of the town. According to the German data, they consisted of 180,000 men. From the 21st of July to the 7th of August, the central front of General Kuznetsov and the reserve front of General Zhukov attempted a number of counterattacks in the region of Belia, Yartsevo and Roslavl, with an end of their rescue. At the cost of incredible efforts, Germans managed to hold their ground. However, several subdivisions succeeded in forcing their way through the encirclement. By the end of July, the casualties of the Central Army Group amounted to 250,000 men, about 20% of the infantry and 50% of military equipment of tank formations. In the first 2 weeks, the Center Army Group advanced on 500-600 kilometers. In the course of the following 2 months, it only made about 1.5-200 kilometers. On the 30th of July, for the first time after levying the war, the German troops were ordered to prepare for defense in the direction of Smolensk. In 1941, Germans were forced to stop their advance towards Smolensk. That made the German headquarters to revise its plans. The Barbarossa plan was falling apart. The German headquarters underestimated the Soviet reserves. During the first 2 weeks of the war, the army groups overcame 500 to 600 kilometers. During the following 2 months, however, it only passed 1.5 to 200 kilometers. It became obvious that Germans failed to encircle and annihilate the main forces of the Red Army to the west of the Dnipro, as the Barbarossa plan stipulated. The head of the General Staff of the German Land Forces, General Haldar, wrote, "It became clear that the methods of military operations and the fighting spirit of the enemy, as well as the geographical conditions of the country, turned out to be absolutely different from those in the previous blitzkriegs." Guderian's tanks turned southward. On the 20th of August, Gomel was seized. The attack spread to Chernihiv and Nizhin. The army of Reichenau came close to the Dnipro, to the south of Kiev, and further to the south, the tanks of von Kleist moved to Kremenchug. On the 14th of September, the troops of Guderian and von Kleist joined forces by Lochtvica in 120 kilometers away from Kiev. Kiev was encircled for 190 kilometers from the northern side and 390 kilometers from the south. The size of the so-called encirclement pot equaled the area of the entire Western Front in France. Germans reported 665,000 people taken prisoners. The remnants of Budionny's army retreated eastwards. By the end of October, the Germans had seized Kursk, Kharkiv, Stalino and Taganrog. On the 30th of October, the troops of Manstein stormed the Perekop Isthmus and entered the Crimea. However, they were fought off by Sebastopol. On the 11th of November, the tanks of von Kleist seized Rostov. Meanwhile, Tymoshenko replaced the dismissed Budionny in Ukraine, while Zhukov was appointed the commander of the Moscow front instead of Tymoshenko. The von Bock's army, reinforced with 48th Infantry and 12 tank divisions, reached the strength of 1.5 million men. On the 2nd of October, it headed for Moscow. Weichels and Guderian attacked an area from Gomel to Orel. Kluge advanced from Roslav to Kaluga, and two other armies were fighting from Smolensk to Vyazma and Zhev. After the great tank battle of Trubchevsk, Orel, and soon afterwards Bryansk, Vyazma, Zhev and Medin was seized. On the 15th of October, the Germans stormed Mozhaisk in 60 kilometers away from Moscow. However, their offensive capacities were exhausted. Awful cold set in 3 weeks earlier than usually. The Soviet defense was much better than in June and July of 1941. Still, on the 5th of December, the Germans managed to seize a wedge in 35 kilometers from Moscow. Germans could see Moscow in their binoculars. Being so close, it nevertheless remained unattainable. On the 6th of December of 1941, Marshal Zhukov's troops went into counterattack by Moscow. The defense of Odessa. The 4th Romanian Army was advancing towards Odessa. The troops of the Coastal Army, namely 2 shooting and 1 cavalry divisions, were retreating to Odessa, restraining the pressure of 5 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions and 1 motorized brigade. The Romanian commanders knew that there were no fortifications by the city, so they expected to seize it easily. However, during the short period of time, quite a few defense lines were erected around Odessa. Their total length was about 250 kilometers long. The general line was at a distance of 20-25 kilometers from Odessa, the main one at 6 to 10 kilometers, and the city internal one was at 6 to 10 kilometers plus the street barricades. The general headquarters gave the following order: Odessa should not surrender. It must be defended as long as possible. The aggressor failed to catch the city by surprise. By the end of August, Romanians blockaded Odessa from the land. The communication with the encircled city was maintained solely by the sea. 4 Soviet divisions faced 14 enemy divisions and 2 brigades. By September, 17 enemy divisions and 2 brigades were already engaged in battles. German-Romanian troops had a 7-fold advantage over our soldiers. On the 20th of August, the storm of the city was resumed. On that day, city defense units had 303 guns, 2 working tanks and 19 properly functioning airplanes at their disposal. On the 21st of September, the fascist troops managed to approach the main defense line in western and southern sectors. In eastern sector, they came right to the city and started to bombard the port and waterways. To neutralize them, a joint forces blow was delivered on the 22nd of September in the eastern sector. The Marines of the 3rd Regiment landed in Grigorievka and were brought from Sevastopol on battleships. The air party landed in the enemy rear, and 2 divisions launched an attack on Fontanka-Gildendorf area. As a result, 2 Romanian divisions were defeated and enemy was thrown 5 to 8 kilometers back. By the end of September, the German-Romanian troops seized Beachhead on the left bank of the Dnieper by Kakhovka, reached the Perekop Isthmus, and cut the Crimea off the country. Under those circumstances, it was decided to use Odessa Defense Forces for strengthening of the Crimea defense. In October, ships of the Black Sea Fleet began a secret evacuation of Odessa defenders to Sevastopol. From the 1st till the 16th of October, all the troops were moved to Sevastopol on battleships and transport vessels without any casualties. There were 86,000 soldiers plus 15,000 of civilians, 19 tanks and armored vehicles, 462 guns, 1,158 cars, 3,625 horses, and 25,000 tons of cargo. In the morning of the 16th of October, the last ship carrying troops left the port of Odessa, and in the evening, the front Romanian units entered Odessa. Note: over 20 enemy divisions took part in the battles of Odessa on a whole. The enemy lost about 160,000 soldiers and officers, approximately 20 airplanes, and around 100 tanks. Thus, the 6th Infantry Division lost 20,132 men, the 14th Division 18,000 men, the 13th and 15th Divisions 16,000 men each. As a result, only 3 fascist divisions managed to preserve over 50% of their personnel. Average daily losses of the enemy amounted to 2,200 men. The Soviets were losing about 565 men a day. The 4th Romanian Army that was first to attack Odessa became totally non-efficient and was sent to Romania for reforming and reinforcement. The Siege of Leningrad. In August, German troops began a large-scale advance towards Leningrad. The Karelian Isthmus and Leningrad were hit by the Finnish Southeastern Army from the north. The German army groups north, under the command of Field Marshal Leib, were trying to break through Luga from the south. At the distant approaches to the city, the enemy ran across fierce resistance and was forced to stop at 20-30 kilometers from Leningrad. On the 5th of September, Marshal Voroshilov was appointed the commander of the Leningrad front. On the 8th of September, the enemy seized Schlisselburg and cut Leningrad off from the land. The siege of Leningrad started. 2 days after that, General Zhukov replaced the commander of the Leningrad front. On the 18th of September, when several attempts of the seizing of the city by the storm failed, Hitler issued a severe order: don't accept Leningrad's surrender, even if it is suggested. From the first days of the siege, the fascists started to bombard the city. According to Germans, their main purpose was to ruin apartment houses and to kill the inhabitants of Leningrad. 2,887,000 people, including suburban residents, found themselves in the siege circle. Among them, 400,000 children. There was neither food nor fuel in Leningrad. In November of 1941, the daily ration of bread, stipulated by workers' card, was 250 grams, and by an official's card, 125 grams. First patients suffering from exhaustion flooded the hospitals in the beginning of November of 1941. By the end of the month, over 11,000 people died from hunger and cold. During December of 1941, almost 53,000 peaceful civilians perished there. That exceeded the annual death rate in Leningrad of 1940. The salvation was promised by the winter road on the ice of the Ladoga Lake. On the 20th of November, when the ice thickened to 180 millimeters, horse-drawn carts were first brought to Nice. On the 22nd of November, the cars followed. The 2-ton trucks carried only 2-3 sacks each, however several cars sank despite such weight restriction. Later sledges were attached to the trucks. It reduced the pressure on the ice and increased the truck's carrying capacity. The road of life was about 30 kilometers long. Technical service centers, fuel filling stations, eateries and first aid posts were built on ice. The route direction varied depending on the weather and military conditions. The enemy continued to bombard the road. By the 29th of November 1941, 52 trucks were lost, and by 6th of December, 126. 2 defense lines were set up in 8-12 kilometers from the bank occupied by the enemy to protect the route. Pillboxes, snow ice trenches and machine guns emplacements were built on ice. Special detachments and fighter planes fought the enemy air force. The Road of Life was open during the entire winter of 1941 and 1942 till the ice started to melt. From the 16th to the 21st of April, the trucks moved half immersed in water. On the 20th of April, the route was closed for about 80 trucks fell in the water that day. At the beginning of December of 1942, the Iskra operation plan was approved to lift the siege. It stipulated smashing the enemy group on the Shlisselburg-Sinyavinsky ledge, 12-16 kilometers long, by counterattacks of the Leningrad front and the Volhovsky front. 2 to 3 lines of ditches connected with pillboxes by numerous passages were dug along the left bank of the Neva, occupied by Germans. They were protected by wire nets, minefields and other obstacles. Each kilometer of the front was exposed to 12 artillery cannons, 12 medium machine guns, 22 light machine guns and 75 guns. 1,873 guns and mortars were concentrated by the city in attack zone of the Soviet Army. On average, there were 144 guns and mortars on each kilometer of the front. That was twice as many as the Soviet artillery had during the Battle of Stalingrad. On the 12th of January of 1942, at 9:30 a.m., the enemy positions faced the fire of over 4,500 of guns and mortars. At 10 minutes to 12 a.m., the attack was launched. On the 18th of January, after bloody street fight, Shlisselburg was liberated, and by the end of the day, the southern bank of the Ladolga Lake was freed too. Thanks to that, a corridor 11 kilometers wide was formed, and Leningrad finally restored its connections with the country. A powerful offensive was launched from within the territory of the huge besieged city, suffering unendurable privations. It went down in the history of wars as an unprecedented case. Note: according to the Soviet official data, 642,000 people died from hunger during the siege. According to other sources, no less than 8,500 people died. The siege was finally raised on the 22nd of January of 1944, after 880 days after its start. By that time, only 560,000 inhabitants remained in the city. That was 1/5 of the original population before the siege. The defense of Sebastopol. On the 25th, 27th of October of 1941, the 11th Army, under the command of Colonel General von Manstein, and consisting of 7 infantry divisions, a Romanian shooting corps, including 2 brigades, 1,500 tanks, and more than 300 airplanes, broke through the defense line of the Soviet troops on Perekop Isthmus and rushed into the Crimea. The Simferopol highway was blocked by the enemy. Thus, the coastal army retreated, taking mountain paths through Aipetri to Yalta and then headed for Sebastopol. That is why, from the 30th of October to the 9th of November, a garrison of Sebastopol had to fight off on its own against the enemy that tried to seize the city. The garrison consisted of 1 brigade, 3 regiments and 19 battalions of Marines, 23,000 men on the whole, about 150 field and coastal guns and 82 airplanes. The main naval forces were concentrated in Sebastopol: 1 battleship, 5 cruisers, 11 torpedo boat destroyers, 16 submarines and other vessels. The major part of the fleet rebased to the Caucasus on the 31st of October. At the beginning of November, the Fascist German command engaged the additional 2 infantry divisions and a motorized brigade trying to break into Sebastopol from the highways of Simferopol and Yevpatoria. The units of Sebastopol's garrison, supported by the coastal naval artillery, stopped the enemy's advance at the front of the main defense lines. On the 11th of November, the enemy concentrated its 4 infantry divisions, 60,000 strong, and resumed its attacks at Sevastopol by directing the main blow from the south and east along the highway of Yalta. In fierce battles, our troops managed to fight all the enemy's attacks off and to hold their ground. On the 21st of November, suffering great losses, the enemy stopped the offensive and turned to defense. However, on the 17th of December, after the destructive artillery and air force preparations, the German-Romanian troops launched the second attack at Sebastopol. On the 21st of December, the 29th Separate Shooting Brigade of Marines was transferred to Sebastopol on 2 cruisers and 3 torpedo-boat destroyers. The Marines counterattacked the enemy on the 22nd of December by the Mykenzievo Mountains and stopped it in its tracks. On the 23rd, 24th of December, the 345th Division and Tank Battalion. On the 28th of December, 386th Shooting Division arrived on battleships and transport vessels. Due to those reinforcements, as well as fire support of the coastal battery, fighting ships and battleship, the enemy was thrown back and the threat of its breakthrough averted. After the failure of the December offensives, relative calm set in that lasted till May of 1942. In May of 1942, the retreat of the Soviet troops from Kerch Peninsula and failure of Kharkov offensive exacerbated the situation in Sebastopol. On the 21st of May, the enemy started to bombard the city, its artillery positions and the rear. On the 2nd of June, it moved towards the artillery and air force preparations that lasted 5 days. Simultaneously, it tightened Sebastopol's blockade from the sea. The enemy gathered 10 divisions, 1 motorized brigade and 3 regiments, 200,000 men in total, 4,500 tanks, 1,325 guns, 725 mortars, and 1,060 airplanes. Sebastopol's garrison consisted of 7 shooting divisions. All of them, except for 1, had only half of its personnel. The garrison also included 4 brigades and 3 regiments of Marines, 106,000 men in total, 38 tanks, 606 guns, 918 mortars, 616 airplanes. On the 7th of June, the enemy started an offensive by directing its main blow from the north and northeast at the Mykenzievo Mountains. It wanted to seize the northern bay and to deliver additional blows at the Sapun Hill and Balaklava. The hostile air force carried out 800 to 1,000 of sorties daily, dropping around 4,500 bombs. The casualties of the defenders grew enormously. By the end of June, there had been no more than 300 to 400 men in each division. At night of 29th of June, the enemy crossed the northern bay and seized the Sapun Hill on the same day. On the 30th of June, the fascist German troops rushed to the ships. Their fierce battles for the Malachov Mount continued all day long. The remnants of the units retreated to the Chersonesus Peninsula by separate groups. At night of the 1st of July, General Headquarters granted permission to evacuate. The last defenders of Sebastopol continued to fight heroically on the Chersonesus Peninsula by the 35th Battery of the Coastal Defense Line till the 4th of July. Then the soldiers were evacuated by submarines and joined guerrilla troops in the mountains. Note: in 2,500 days of the Battle of Sebastopol, the enemy had 300,000 men killed and wounded. It lost 400 tanks and 900 airplanes. As many enemy soldiers and officers perished as the Hitler's army had lost in total before its attack at the USSR. The Battle of Moscow. On the 2nd of October of 1941, the Center Army groups launched an attack on Moscow. The operation was codenamed Typhoon. In the course of this operation, Hitler ordered, Moscow must be encircled so that not a single Russian soldier, not a single inhabitant, be it a man, a woman or a child, could leave it. Any attempt of leaving Moscow should be suppressed by force. The German command moved additional forces from other sectors of the front to Moscow. The total strength of the Center Army groups reached 1,800,000 people, almost 75 divisions, including 14 tank and 8 motorized ones. Over 14,000 guns and mortars, 1,700 tanks and about 1,390 airplanes were at their disposal. The Soviet command was able to face such a powerful enemy group with much more modest forces. 3 of its regiments, the Western Reserve and the Bryansk, consisted of 1,250,000 people, 7,600 guns and mortars, 990 tanks, 677 airplanes. The German offensive started at the old Smolensk road that led Napoleon to Moscow. Indeed, it resembled a furious typhoon. In the first weeks of October, the Germans surrounded two Soviet armies between Vyazma and Bryansk. According to Germans, they took 650,000 soldiers and officers prisoners, captured 5,000 guns and 1,200 tanks. The breakthrough in the defense lines was 500 kilometers long. By the 20th of October, German frontline tank units had been already standing in 65 kilometers from Moscow. The Soviet representative officers and foreign embassies were evacuated to Kuybyshev hastily. The autumn impassable mud and roads, followed by frost, became a serious obstacle for German columns. That was the most severe winter in the last 140 years. However, the basic factor that determined the outcome of the battle was not the weather, but fierce resistance of the Soviet troops and their indestructible desire not to surrender. But it seemed to Hitler, who was relying on maps, that his troops were capable of overcoming 50 remaining kilometers in one rush. Hadn't they already passed 800 to 900 kilometers? On the 7th of November, a military parade took place in Moscow on the Red Square. Stalin himself appealed to the troops from the platform of the mausoleum. Hitler, who was listening to the radio in his wolf's flare, ran across Stalin's speech by chance. He understood what he was going on and got furious. He immediately called in the best aviation unit commander in order to deliver a blow at Moscow without delay. However, the German aces failed to come close to Moscow. At night from the 30th of November to the 1st of December, the German airborne troops landed in Moscow on the Vorobyovy Hills and in Neskuchny Garden in 4 kilometers from Kremlin. They were ordered to kidnap Stalin. The landing party was eliminated by the Moscow garrison. On the 5th of December, the Germans were finally stopped along the front 300 kilometers long around Moscow. On the 6th of December, Zhukov carried out a retaliatory attack. 3 Soviet fronts, the Kalinin of Konev, the western of Zhukov, and the southwestern of Cherevichenko, went into offensive at the temperature of -30 and in knee-deep snow. There were 100 divisions consisting of either fresh forces or the troops hardened in combat units. German units failed to fully recover after that blow. For a period of several weeks, they had been continuously retreating under the strong pressure of our troops. The front was thrown back from Moscow to 150-400 kilometers. The offensive of the Soviet army continued till the 20th of April of 1942. Germans' losses exceeded 300,000 soldiers and officers, 1,300 tanks, and 2,500 of guns. But the scale of the defeat was much greater. The chief of the General Staff of Land Forces, General Galda, wrote down in his diary, "The myth of the invincibility of German army has been discredited." Note: for the first 193 days of the war, Germany lost 1.5 million people killed, wounded and taken prisoners. The crushing defeat of Poland cost the Germans 44,000 people in total. The seizure of France, 154,000 people. 40 tanks survived out of the entire Guderian's army, while Gepner was only 15 tanks left. The Battle of Stalingrad, defensive period. By the summer of 1942, the Nazi German headquarters had worked out a plan to defeat the Soviet troops in the south of the country, to seize the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus and the agricultural areas of the Don and Kuban, to break the communications connecting the center of the country with the Caucasus, and to create conditions to win the war. In the offensive, launched in 1942, the German headquarters especially emphasized the importance of Stalingrad seizure. To seize Stalingrad, the fascists decided to deliver a blow of the joint forces of the 6th Army and the 4th Tank Army. By the 22nd of July, the enemy had pulled up 18 divisions to Stalingrad. They were 250,000 people strong. They also had about 740 tanks, 1,200 airplanes, 7,500 of guns and mortars. 16 Soviet divisions, consisting of 187,000 people, had 360 tanks, 337 airplanes, 7,900 guns and mortars at their disposal. The 23rd of August of 1942 became the most horrible day for the inhabitants of Stalingrad. German bombers attacked the city shrouding the sky with a smoke shield. Wooden buildings that were abundant in Stalingrad suburbs burned to ashes. Only walls of many-storied buildings remained after the bombings. Waves of German Air Force came one by one. An Air Force raid at Stalingrad became the largest scale at the Eastern Front. The 4th Air Army of General von Richthofen completed 1,500 sorties in one day, dropped 1,000 tons of bombs and lost only 2 aircraft. About 40,000 people perished in the first week of raids in Stalingrad. On the 23rd of August, the enemy managed to break through to the Volga northwards of the city. The situation was critical. The fascists subjected Stalingrad to continuous bombardments. The city lied in ruins. On the 25th of August, a siege was announced. Hitlerites failed to seize the city by storming it from the north along the Volga. Fascists were stopped on the northwestern outskirts of Stalingrad. Beginning from mid-September, when the enemy approached the city from the west and southwest, the 62nd Army was entrusted with further defense of Stalingrad. Fierce street fights broke out in the city. The Mamayev Mound, the territories of Tractor Plant, the barricades and the Red October plants, streets and houses passed from hands to hands repeatedly. The city's streets and squares became the battlefield. It was in Stalingrad that an assault team method and later the tactics of the close fight were worked out. An assault team consisted of a shooting platoon or company, 1 to 2 squads of heavy machine guns, a squad of knapsack flamethrowers, a squad of field engineers, 2-3 guns, a squad of anti-tank guns, and sometimes 1 or 2 tanks. It was armed with guns, grenades and knives. An assault team delivered sudden and constant blows from the front, the flanks and the rear, without giving the enemy an opportunity to recover and have a rest. The enemy could use neither aviation nor mass artillery fire against it. The guardsmen turned the stone buildings of the house of Sergeant Pavlov, the house of Lieutenant Zabolotny, the mill number 4 into strongholds. The house of Pavlov was a brick structure towering over the city. It was a convenient lookout that faced the part of the city occupied by the enemy. Its guards fired at the enemy 1 kilometer to the west and even further to the north and to the south. On the 20th of September of 1942, Sergeant Pavlov and his squad managed to enter the house. Later, the reinforcement arrived consisting of machine gun platoon, group of anti-tank riflemen, 4 mortarmen, and 2 50mm mortars and 3 gunners. Embrasures were broken in the walls and windows that enabled the soldiers to open fire from different places of the building. Marshal Chukov noted, "The small group defending one house eliminated more enemy soldiers than the Hitlerites lost during the seizure of Paris." In the period from July till November, the enemy's losses grew to 700,000 people, more than 1,000 tanks, about 2,000 guns and mortars, and over 1,400 airplanes. The advance of the fascist German troops at the Stalingrad direction was stopped short. By the end of the defensive period of the Battle of Stalingrad, our 62nd Army took control over the Tractor Plant, the Barricades Plant, and the northeastern blocks of the city center. The 64th Army defended the approaches to the southern part of the city bravely. The counterattack of Stalingrad. The plan of the counterattack of Stalingrad was codenamed the Uranium. The task of the Southwestern Front was to carry out massive attacks from the beachheads of the right bank of the Don by Serfmochi and Kletska. The striking troops of the Stalingrad Front launched an attack from the area of the Serpinsky Lakes. The striking troops of both fronts had to join forces in the Kalach-Sovetski area and to surround main forces of the enemy by Stalingrad. Simultaneously, a part of the forces of the Southwestern Front delivered the blows to the south and southwest. The Stalingrad Front attacked the southwestern direction to support the attacks of the striking troops and to form the external front of encirclement. On the 19th of November of 1942, after powerful artillery preparations, the army formations of the southwestern and the Don fronts started to counterattack. On the 20th of November, the Stalingrad Front joined the offensive. About 1 million of people, 13,500 guns and mortars, more than 1,000 anti-aircraft artillery, 115 battalions of rocket artillery, about 900 tanks, and 1,115 airplanes took part in the counterattack simultaneously. Main forces of the German Army Group B that acted in the region of the Don and Stalingrad were about 1 million strong. They had 675 tanks and assault guns, more than 10,000 guns and mortars, and no less than 1,200 airplanes. On the 23rd of November at 4 p.m., the front units of the Southwestern and the Stalingrad fronts met in the agreed point of the snow-covered plain by Sovietsky Farm. The main forces of the 6th Army and part of the 4th Tank Army, including 22 divisions and 160 detached units, 330,000 strong in total, found themselves encircled. By the end of November, the Soviet troops formed more than 500-kilometer ring of external encirclement. By the 24th, 30th of November, the troops of the Don and Stalingrad fronts halved the area occupied by fascist German troops in fierce battles. They pressed the enemy on the territory of 78 kilometers from the west to the east and 34 kilometers from north to the south. On the 12th of December, Hitler's headquarters attempted to run the blockade by an attack near Kotelnikovo village. However, the Soviet headquarters managed to stop and later to defeat the fascist troops by engaging the Second Guard Army into the battle. Almost simultaneously with the Kotelnikovo operation, the Soviet troops started their advance on the Don to the west of Stalingrad. That made the fascists give up the idea of rescuing the surrounded group once and for all. On the 8th of January of 1943, the Soviet headquarters laid down the capitulation ultimatum to the commandment of the 6th German Army. However, it was rejected. On the 10th of January, the Soviet troops started an offensive operation, The Ring, aspiring to crush the enemy. Fierce battles knew no breaks. Now it was turn of the Soviet troops and commanders to be amazed by the enemy's resistance capabilities. There were times when the German soldiers continued to fire back with only two healthy, not frost-bitten fingers and hands. Despair, courage, orders of commandment, and personal human qualities, they had it all. On the 26th of January, the surrounded group was divided into two parts. In the morning of the 31st, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of General Field Marshal. He did it knowing that Paulus would commit a suicide. There were no precedents of taking a field marshal prisoner in the history of Germany. However, he had no choice but to issue the last and the only order in his role of General Field Marshal in order to capitulate. The southern group of the fascist German troops stopped organized military operations. The northern groups of Wehrmacht forces under the command of Infantry General Streicher refused to surrender. On the 1st of February, the Soviet artillery and aviation delivered the Germans the powerful blow. Blindages and armed buildings were destroyed with field guns. The Soviet tanks pressed the last weapon emplacement of the enemy by caterpillar tracks. During January and February of 1943, 91,545 soldiers and officers, among them 24 generals, were taken prisoners in the course of the battles. Note: the total losses of the fascist German troops in the period from 19th of November 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943 amounted to over 800,000 people, about 2,000 tanks and assault guns, more than 10,000 guns and mortars, no less than 3,000 fighting and transport aircraft, and more than 70,000 cars. That is 25% of all the army in the East. Three-day mourning was declared in Germany. The defeat of the enemy on the Volga marked the turning point in the course of the Great Patriotic War and the World War II on the whole. The expulsion of enemy troops from the Soviet territories began. Battle for the Caucasus. The concept of German headquarters operation in the Caucasus under the codename Edelweiss lied in surrounding and destroying Soviet troops to the south and southeast of Rostov-on-the-Don. Further offensive assumed the bypass of main Caucasian Ridge in the west and the seashore of Novorossiysk and Tuapse, and in the east, Grozny and Baku with their oil. Simultaneously with conducting of this turning maneuver, it was planned to cross Ridge in its center section through the passes, to come to Transcaucasia and to draw Turkey in military actions. One could hardly imagine how things would have turned out if the enemy had passed through the Caucasian Ridge. On the southern boundary against the USSR were arranged 26 Turkish divisions ready for action. On the 25th of July 1942, German troops began an offensive along the Solsk, Stavropol and Krasnodar directions. Forces of the southern front, under the pressure of enemy's numerically superior forces, were forced to withdraw to the south and southeast. A lot of units lost their artillery and tanks with practically no air cover. As a result, Soviet troops suffered enormous losses. However, from August till December 1942, they stopped the enemy on approaches toward Janikidze and then forced it to start the defense. The enemy managed to capture almost all passes in the central section of the main Caucasian Ridge, but soon the threat of German troops breaking in through the Transcaucasia was removed. Suffering enormous losses, German troops were forced to start the defense. Soviet troops had to leave the North Caucasus region and go back to the passes of main Caucasian Ridge and to the Terek River. The offensive period of the battle for the Caucasus began on the 1st of January 1943. Having adopted the success of the counter-offensive in the environs of Stalingrad, forces of the southern front began an offensive on Rostov by main bodies and on Tikhoretsk by the part of the forces. The Black Sea group of forces of Transcaucasian Front launched an offensive on Krasnodar and Tikhoretsk, and the northern group of forces on Mozdok, Prokhladny, Armavir. Trying to escape encirclement, the enemy troops began to retreat from the region of Mozdok in the northwestern direction. The Black Sea group of forces freed Maykop on the 29th of January and then, in the course of Krasnodar operation, on the 12th of February, Krasnodar. On the 9th of the 4th of February, the Black Sea fleet landed an amphibious force southwest of Novorossiysk in the region of Mishako, more than 15,000 people with the artillery and tanks. The landing took a small bridgehead that went down in history by the name of Malaya Zemlya, and played an important role in the release of Novorossiysk. The enemy was forced to lead his main forces to Donetsk Basin and started defense by the units of the 17th Army on the prepared line in Kuban in the so-called Blue Line. A reference. The Blue Line is the system of superpowered German fortifications on the Taman Peninsula nearby Novorossiysk. 16 divisions of the 17th Army numbered nearly 500,000 people, supported by 1,040 airplanes, being based on the Kerch Peninsula. Just in the sky of Kuban, within April-June 1943, took place one of the biggest air battles. It involved more than 2,000 airplanes of the 4th Air Force of General Vershinin and the 4th Air Fleet of Field Marshal Richthofen. Sometimes up to 50 group air battles were waged per day, involving 34 and sometimes even more airplanes from either side. In the course of these battles, the Soviet Air Forces put an end to German supremacy in the sky. For the breakthrough of the Blue Line, the amphibious forces were prepared. On a whole, the landing forces consisted of 150 fighting ships, launchers, and support ships of the Black Sea Fleet. On the 10th of September 1943, at 2:44 a.m., after the impacts of artillery and aircraft, torpedo boats of an assault group cut their way to the port. They delivered an impact on the enemy piers and coastal fortifications. 30 pillboxes and bunkers were destroyed. The assault group, having exploded wire barriers, gave a signal and declared the entrance of the port to be opened. Through the 80 meters wide gates broke in the launchers of the attacking group, destroying the weapon emplacements of the enemy on the berth of the shore and on the landing points. The fascist artillery focused its fire on the entry gate to harbor and on the ships that carried landing. However, the first group of the landing ships cut its way through the fire to harbor. There were more than 800 people. After a while, they captured 6 berths on the northwest part of the port. The first group was soon followed by 2 more. On the 15th of September, the defense of the enemy of the environs of Novorossiysk was broken. By 10 a.m. of the 16th of September, the port and the city were completely freed from Hitlerites. On the 9th of October, Soviet troops drove an aggressor away from the Taman Peninsula, which was the last enemy bridgehead in the Caucasus region. There is no alive German left in Kuban and the Taman Peninsula, excluding captives. These words from the report of General Petrov to Stalin became an original epilogue to the battle for the Caucasus. In the battle for the Caucasus, the losses of German army numbered 580,000 people. Soviet losses, nearly 800,000 people. The Battle of Kursk. The Kursk Arch was the protrusion of a front line in the area of Kursk. It formed as a result of battles carried out in the winter and in early spring of 1943. There were the right wing of the German Army Group Center, commanded by General Field Marshal Kluge, threatened the forces of General Rokossovsky's Central Front from the north. On the left flank, the Army Group South, under the command of General Field Marshal Manstein, resisted the forces of General Vatutin's Voronezh Front in the south. In the summer of 1943, the German headquarters decided to carry out the Citadel operation. It was to do away with Kursk Arch and to destroy the Soviet troops defending it. According to the plan of the operation, they were to surround and destroy the Soviet troops by Kursk by delivering strikes from the north and south of Kursk direction. If successful, Germans were to move to the Panther operation to cross the forces of the Southwestern Front and to go deeper into the rear of the Soviet troops, endangering Moscow. However, the General Headquarters figured out the intentions of the enemy just in time and decided to go into active defense in order to weaken the shocking groups of German troops and to start the counterattack. Knowing the time of the planned German offensive, the Soviet headquarters carried out the artillery counter-preparation in areas of the enemy striking group's concentration. Trying to restore control over the confused troops, the fascist commandment delayed the start of the operation for 2.5 to 3 hours. In the morning of the 5th of July, Hitlerites launched an offensive in the north of Kursk, directing the main blow at Olkhovatka area. Having encountered fierce resistance, the enemy was forced to engage all the forces of the striking group in the battle. However, the results were far from expected. The enemy tried to strike in the region of Ponyri settlement but failed to break through the defense of the Central Front. Hitlerites only managed to pass 10 to 12 kilometers. By the 10th of July, their offensive opportunities had been exhausted. Having lost almost two-thirds of tanks, Germans were forced to go into defense. At the same time, the enemy attempted storming Oboyan and Korocha in the south but failed. Then the enemy redirected its attacks towards the area of Prokhorovka. On the 12th of July, the biggest tank battle in World War II took place by Prokhorovka. According to some sources, about 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns were involved. On that day, the main striking force of the Voronezh Front, the 5th Guard Tank Army of General Rotmistrov, engaged into a counterblow in the narrow 10-kilometer-long strip of the front. It so happened that the blow was directed frontally at the divisions of the 2nd German SS Armored Corps, Adolf Hitler, that were preparing for a decisive march towards Prokhorovka. The brigades of the first echelon cut through the fighting arrays of the German troops and literally divided the attacking enemy. The veil of smoke, dust and earth raised by the explosions and tanks' caterpillars shrouded the field. The light tanks T-70, which made up one-third of Rotmistrov's troops, could not resist the perfect Tigers. The Tigers and Ferdinands that were retreating to the artillery zone action along with the Air Force called in to help caused great damage to the Soviet tank army. According to some estimates, in one day of the battle, the opposing sides lost from 30 to 60% of tanks and self-propelled artillery units. The total losses suffered in the Battle of Prokhorovka are still disputed by historians and the military. But that was the day of a turning point in the Battle of Kursk. The enemy stopped the offensive. On the 18th of July, it began to retreat to its original positions. On the 19th of July, the troops of the Voronezh Front were joined by the forces of Steppe Front under the command of General Konev. Together, they pursued the enemy, and by the 23rd of July, threw it back to the positions occupied before the attack. In the course of further offensive operations, the Soviet troops had an advantage of twice as many soldiers and 4 times as much artillery as the Germans. On the 12th of July, the troops of the Western Front and the Bryansk Front went into an offensive in direction of Orel in accordance with the Operation Kutuzov plan. On the 15th of July, the Central Front started to counter-offensive too. In accordance with the plan, the troops of the Voronezh and the Steppe Front, supported by the Southwestern Front, carried out the Commander Rumentsov operation in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction. Operation started in the morning of the 3rd of August. Having broken through the deep multi-level defense of the enemy, the Soviet troops walked almost 20 kilometers and liberated Belgorod on the 5th of August. In the evening of the same day, an artillery salute in honor of Orel's and Belgorod's liberators was fired in Moscow for the first time. On the 23rd of August, Kharkiv was liberated too. In the course of the operations, the Soviet troops freed Kharkiv industrial region, moved 140 kilometers deeper inland, endangering the entire southern wing of the enemy. That created favorable conditions for the liberation of the left bank Ukraine. Note, the total losses of Wehrmacht in the Battle of Kursk amounted to over 500,000 soldiers and officers, about 1,500 tanks, 3,000 guns and over 3,500 of airplanes. The Soviet troops lost 860,000 people, over 6,000 tanks and artillery mounts, more than 5,000 guns and mortars, and over 1,500 airplanes. The Battle of the Dnieper. After the defeats by Moscow, Stalingrad and Kursk, the German command counted on stopping the advance of the Red Army with fierce resistance. It planned to keep the most important industrial regions to the east of the Dnieper to itself. Germans built a huge strategic defense line called the Eastern Rampart. It went along the Kerch Peninsula, the river Molochna along the Dnieper, to the east of Pskov, and to the north of the Chutsko Lake and the river Narva. The main part of the Eastern Rampart was the Dnieper with its fortifications. The wide and deep river, with high right bank, was a serious obstacle for any offensives. During one of the meetings, Hitler claimed, "There are more chances of the Dnieper turning its current than the Russians crossing it." The Red Army was faced by 2 Field and 2 Tank South Army groups of General Field Marshal Manstein and the 2nd German Army Group Center under the command of General Field Marshal Kluge. By the 20th of September, the Soviet troops had liberated Ukraine and Donbass. They approached the Dnieper and without any break started to cross the river in several points at once. The front units crossed the Dnieper in the fishermen boats, floats, on logs and clutching to empty barrels under the enemy fire. Our soldiers built necessary bridgeheads. After that, they constructed bridges under the enemy fire to transport heavy machinery and artillery. General Martel described the building of such a bridge. The majority of bridges stood in piles made from the trees chopped on the spot. At first, a group of people with axes appeared on the bank. Officers in boats measured the depth of water and drafted approximate schemes of the bridges. They sharpened pencils with the same axes. Then the soldiers went into the forest and chopped woods for piles. The construction of one bridge took 4 days. The bridge could bear a weight of 10 tons. Its construction was a real feat. Formations of the 13th Army of the Central Front and the 3rd Guard Tank Army of the Voronezh Front were the first to approach the Dnieper by Bolshaya Bukreya to the north of River Pripyat. Later, formations of 19 more armies seized 22 bridgeheads. Moreover, 2 bridgeheads were seized on the right bank of the Pripyat. The Soviet troops managed to hold onto these bridgeheads and to enlarge them. The Soviet troops liberated almost the entire left bank Ukraine, the entire Donbass, and approached the Dnieper. They managed to defeat about 30 enemy divisions along the front 750 kilometers long from the city of Lviv to Zaporozhye. The fiercest battle took place on the course of crossing the Dnieper to the north of Kiev by the village of Lutizh. The Soviet troops fought heroically on the right bank holding onto the seized bridgehead. The 5th Guard Rank Corps went to their rescue. Another river Desna stood on their way. They had no time to build bridges, so the tankmen decided to cross the river by the bottom, though the depth was twice the admissible. They stuffed all the cracks in the machines and hatches with oiled cloths. The muffler tubes were covered with tarpaulin and raised above the water. The tankmen drove their tanks blindly, listening to the commanders who supervised the crossing of the tank barges above the water. 60 tanks T-34 crossed the Desna in a day. To liberate Kiev, the 1st Ukrainian Front's command planned to strike a decisive blow from the Bukrin bridgehead 60 kilometers away. In October, they launched the offensive twice, but the enemy was too strong. That's why it was decided to attack not from Bukrin, but from the Lutizh bridgehead and to advance towards the south from there. At night, our tanks started to move from the Bukrin bridgehead to the left bank of the Dnieper. On the left bank, they passed 200 kilometers to the south and crossed the river to the Lutizh bridgehead again. They did it so skillfully and carefully that the enemy failed to notice the maneuver. The Soviet formation that stayed by Bukrin imitated an attempt to break through the enemy lines. In the morning of the 3rd of November, the armies of Generals Chernyakhovsky and Moskalenko outflanked Kiev from the west and went into offensive, taking the enemy by surprise. Fierce battles continued at the Bukrin bridgehead as well. There, the 40th Army of General Zhmachenko, the 27th Army of General Trofimenko, went into offensive 2 days earlier to divert the enemy's attention. In the evening of the 4th of November, the Guard Tank Army of General Rybalko joined in the offensive. The tanks moved with lights and sirens turned on. By the evening, the troops of the 38th Army had reached Kiev suburbs. By midnight, the Soviet troops broke through into the city. By 4 a.m. on the 6th of November, Kiev was liberated. Note: in the course of the Battle of the Dnieper, the Red Army lost over 1.5 million people. According to German data, the losses of Germans at the Soviet-German front from June of 1943 to February 1944, that is almost the entire duration of the battle, amounted to about 1,600,000 people. Liberation Movement of 1945. By the end of 1943, 257 German divisions out of 376 and 25 tank divisions out of 32 were fighting against the Soviet Army. The Soviet command planned to go into offensive in 1944 at the fronts from the Black to the Baltic Sea, delivering its main blow in the southwest. In January and February of 1944, the Red Army ran Leningrad's siege. By spring, it had carried out a series of major operations and liberated the right bank Ukraine and the Crimea. The Soviet troops approached the Carpathians and entered the territory of Romania. In the course of the winter campaign of 1944, due to the Red Army's attacks, the enemy lost 13 divisions and 6 brigades. That's over a million people. The 24th of January, the 17th of February of 1944, Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation. German troops lost 55,000 people killed and 18,000 taken prisoners. May and April of 1944, German troops advanced in the south. Mykolaiv was liberated on the 28th of March, Odessa on the 10th of April. The 8th of April, the 12th of May of 1944, the Crimea was liberated. Note: in 1941-1942, despite the German superiority in machinery, aviation and manpower, Sevastopol held its ground for 250 days. In 1944, the Soviet troops seized the city in 4 days. In March of 1944, after the failure of operations in the south, recent Hitler's favorite Field Marshal Manstein lost his post. After the catastrophe in the Crimea and at the Southern Bug, Field Marshal von Kleist met with the same fate. On the 26th of March of 1944, the Soviet troops approached the USSR's borders. In June of 1944, the English and American forces landed in Normandy and in the south of France. The second front was opened. In June of 1944, the Soviet troops attacked the Finnish forces. After that, Finland asked for truce, which was accepted on the 19th of September of 1944 in Moscow. The grandiose offensive of the Red Army in Belarus that lasted from the 24th of June to the 29th of August of 1944, and in western Ukraine from the 13th of July to the 29th of August of the same year, resulted in crushing defeats of 2 major strategic groups of Wehrmacht, taking control over 600 kilometers of the German front and defeating 82 German divisions. In the course of the Belarus operation, the Red Army marched from the Dnieper to the Wisla, leaving 500 to 600 kilometers behind. The Soviet troops liberated the entire Belarus, the majority of Lithuania, and entered the territory of Poland. As a result of the Belarus operation, the Army Group Center was defeated. Wehrmacht lost more than 539,000 people. 380,000 were killed and 158,000 taken prisoners. Losses of the Soviet amounted to 233,000 people. In comparison with other strategic operations of 1944, the Belarus operation cost the Red Army the hugest losses of personnel. On average, it was losing 11,000 people every single day. It is evidence of the fierceness of the battles and of the Germans' desperate resistance. It is confirmed by the fact that the number of Wehrmacht soldiers and officers killed in the course of that operation was 2.5 times higher than the number of people who yielded themselves prisoners. On the 3rd of July, Minsk was liberated. The 13th of July, the 29th of August of 1944, Lviv-Sandomir operation. The Red Army defeated the fascist army group Northern Ukraine. They devastated 32 divisions, annihilating 8 of them completely. They liberated the western regions of Ukraine and southeastern regions of Poland. In the south, in the course of Yassi-Kishinev operation of 1944, the Red Army defeated the army group Southern Ukraine, eliminating 18 divisions. During August and September of 1944, our troops liberated Romania, Bulgaria, and a part of Yugoslavia. Romania and Bulgaria denounced their union with Germany and declared a war on it. The Red Army continued its powerful offensive from July to November of 1944, when it liberated the Baltic states. There, it defeated 26 German divisions of the Army Groups North. The main forces of the group, that consisted of 27 divisions and 1 brigade, were forced back to the Kulansky Peninsula and lost their strategic importance. On the 15th of September 1944, Finland declared a war on Germany. Note: during 10 months of 1944, the Red Army troops carried out 11 strategic offensive operations, and at the beginning of October they started the 12th one, the Budapest campaign. Every single one of them ended in victory. The Liberation Campaign. The Soviet troops, together with the Romanian and Bulgarian forces, launched their offensive in the Carpathians and in Belgrade and Budapest directions. On the 20th of September of 1944, our troops, together with the Czechoslovak units, crossed the border and started liberation of Czechoslovakia. 1944. From the 28th of September to the 20th of October, the Soviet troops, Liberation Army of Yugoslavia, and forces of the Bulgarian front carried out the Belgrade operation. On the 20th of October, Belgrade was liberated by the Soviet troops and units of the Liberation Army. The German army, Group Serbia, was eliminated. German groups F and E suffered a crushing defeat, losing over 100,000 people killed and wounded. 1944. The 7th, 27th of October. At Kirkenes operation. The north of Norway and the entire Kola Peninsula were liberated from Nazis. From the 29th of September 1944 to the 4th of April 1945, Hungary had been liberated from the Hitlerites and the Hungarian troops of Szalasi regime. On the 22nd of December 1944, the Provisional Government of Hungary was founded in the city of Debrecen, liberated from the Germans. It declared a war on Germany and on the 20th of January of 1945 signed a peace treaty with the USSR and its allies in Moscow. On the 13th of February 1945, Budapest was liberated. According to some data, the total losses of the Red Army in 1944 amounted to 6,503,204 people killed, wounded, taken prisoner and sick. Till January of 1945, Germany had 299 divisions and 31 brigades. Among them, 169 German divisions and 20 brigades and 16 Hungarian divisions and 1 brigade fought against the USSR. The Soviet fronts, under the command of Marshals Chernyakhovsky and Rokossovsky, acted in the north. The former advanced from Memele towards the south and the latter from the river Narov to the north towards eastern Prussia. The troops of Marshals Zhukov and Konev fought in the center. The troops of the former advanced towards Warsaw and Berlin, and the troops of the latter moved to the Upper Silesia and had to cross the Oder. The fronts of Marshals Malinovsky and Tulbuchin fought in the south. They were ordered to liberate Silesia, seize Budapest and advance towards Vienna. The troops of General Petrov that fought between Marshals Malinovsky's and Konev's fronts had to drive the Germans out to the northern Carpathians. In total, over 300 divisions and 25 tank armies fought at the 7 fronts. 1945, the 12th of January, the 3rd of February, the Wisla-Oder operation of the Soviet forces. They destroyed 35 German divisions. 25 generals lost from 50 to 70% of their personnel. About 120,000 people were taken prisoners. In the course of the operation, Poland and a considerable part of Czechoslovakia were completely liberated. 1945, the 13th of January, the 25th of April, the Eastern Prussian operation of the Soviet troops. Germans defended Königsberg with fantastic persistence. The city was not fully encircled because of the sea routes from Pillau remained open. On the 1st of February, Chernyakhovsky seized Friedland, and on the 9th of February, Preussisch-Eylau. On the 17th of February, he was mortally wounded. Marshal Vasilevsky took over his post. At the beginning of March, Vasilevsky's troops encircled Königsberg, but the real storm began only on the 18th of April. The next day, the city capitulated. On the 16th of March of 1945, the Vienna offensive of the Soviet troops was launched. On the 13th of April, Vienna was seized. Berlin was the last outpost of the fascist Germany that fell under the Soviet troops' pressure. The Battle of Berlin. From the 16th of April to the 8th of May of 1945, the troops of Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarus Front, Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarus Front, and Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front carried out the Berlin offensive. Some forces of the Baltic Fleet, the long-range aviation, troops of anti-air raid, the Dnipro military flotilla, and the 1st and the 2nd armies of the Polish army were also involved. Over 2.5 million people took part in the attack, having 42,000 cannons and mortars, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled artillery, and 7,500 military planes at their disposal. The German army groups that defended Berlin amounted to about 1 million people, 10,400 cannons and mortars, 1,500 tanks of storm cannons, and 3,300 military planes. The Berlin Defense District consisted of 3 rings of defense fortifications. All the big buildings in the city were turned into base stations. Streets and squares were blocked by fortified barricades. On the 16th of April of 1945 at 5 a.m., our artillery opened fire at the enemy fortifications. At the same time, 150 powerful searchlights were mounted every 200 meters. They blinded the enemy and prevented it from firing correctly. Marshal Zhukov recalled, "From the very first minutes, Hitler's troops were practically buried under the sea of fire and metal. From the 16th to the 19th of April, the Soviet troops managed to break through the Oder-Nesensk line of the enemy defense. On the 20th of April, the storm of Berlin began. On the 24th of April, the troops of the 1st Belarus and the 1st Ukrainian fronts joined forces at the south and east of the city and divided the enemy group into 2. As a result of the storm, the forces of the 9th German Army and some formations of the 4th Tank Army were cut off Berlin and encircled in the eastern suburbs of the city. On the 25th of April, the troops of the 1st Belarus and 1st Ukrainian fronts met in the area of Ketzin and tightened the ring around Berlin. In such a way, about 200,000 Hitler soldiers were encircled by the German capital and 200,000 people in Berlin itself. On the same day, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front met with the 12th American Army Group of General Bradley on the Elbe. Together, they eliminated the enemy in Berlin in the course of fierce street battles. On the 26th of April, the Berlin group was divided into several units. The troops of the 1st Belarus Front approached the city from the west, south and east. The troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front went to meet them from the south and southwest. On the 28th of April, the Berlin group was divided into 3 isolated parts. Fascist German command practically lost its control over their forces. Street battles in Berlin knew no breaks. In the evening of the 30th of April, the Soviet troops stormed Reichstag and raised the victory red flag there. The troops of the 1st Belarus and the 1st Ukrainian fronts managed to liquidate the group encircled in the east of Berlin. When our forces approached the Imperial Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide. On the 1st of May, Habsburg radio station announced about Hitler's death. Gross Admiral Dönitz became the head of the German government. The elimination of the Berlin Group lasted till the 2nd of May, when the Hitlerites stopped resistance altogether. On the 2nd of May, Konev sent the last telegram about the Berlin operation to Moscow. Today, on the 2nd of May of 1945, the troops of the front seized the southwestern and central districts of Berlin after 9-day street battles, in frames of dividing line determined for the front, and together with the troops of the First Belarus Front, took control over Berlin. The battle with separate groups trying to break through to the west continued till the 9th of May. On the 8th of May of 1945, representatives of German command signed the Capitulation Act in Karlshorst on unconditional surrender of the joint German forces. At the end of the Berlin operation, over 600 its participants were awarded with the titles of the Hero of the Soviet Union, and 13 of them became the heroes for the second time. In the course of the Berlin operation, the Soviets suffered incredible losses. Over 350,000 people were killed and wounded. 101,961 people were declared missing. Unfortunately, Interchannel cannot tell you about all the military, political and everyday events of that war. We can't name all the villages and cities from Brest to Moscow and from Stalingrad to Berlin, where our soldiers fought for our descendants' right for freedom and life. The most horrible war in the history of mankind lasted 1,418 days and nights. The war.